27 minutes past the hour, Miller and Moulton. Thanks for being with us, whether it be on Southwest Florida's Fox Sports Radio, whether you stream us at millerandmoulton.com, or whether you are looking live at Bud Elliott joining us on the Miller and Moulton Twitch.tv channel. You lost your podcast partner this week. Okay, it used to be the Barton and Bud podcast. All right. And I bring this up because I find this very interesting. You know, there's a lot of content that's out there. Some of it just fills time. Some of it's really good and insightful. But it's one thing for sportscasters and sports fans to think, hey, you know, that Barton and Bud, those guys are good. They know what they're talking about. They've got research. It's another thing for a college football coach who's trying to build a program to reach out to a member of the media, if you will, and say, you know, your info is so good, and you know what? Help me build this program. I just found the hire that Vanderbilt reached out to your broadcast partner and said, help me with recruiting. Let's help build this thing. I think that was a fascinating hire.
I do as well. First of all, I think Barton is, you know, very qualified for the gig, right? He was the director of scouting for 24/7 for a decade. He played college football at Yale. He's always been a guy. I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to work here is because I loved swapping ideas with him at these camps we would go to, even when I was working, you know, for a prior network. We have seen this happen in other sports, right? Like Effectively Wild, the really popular baseball podcast, has lost like 3 people to pro teams because of the analysis they do and the statistical breakdowns and the, you know, prospect evaluations. We've seen this happen in the NBA. We had not really seen this happen in football yet. And we talked about this on an episode of Barton and Bud. Like, hey, why don't you guys go work for a team if you're so good? And the answer I gave basically was, I'm not going to take that big of a pay cut, right? For the most part, you have to like people are like, oh, you're so smart to work for a team. Like, yeah, but I would probably have to go and take more of an entry level position, making 45 or 50, because a lot of these backroom guys, they kind of make pennies compared to what, you know, the head coach make, and then prove myself for a couple of years. And I don't think that would really fly with my wife. Now, Barton
especially since you've already done that 10 or so years ago, right?
But right, you left the law practice to get into sports. I mean, that's a pay cut and a half.
Right. I mean, you sold it once. That's a tough sell the second time around.
Now I was single at the time, so it wasn't much of a, you know, I just had to sell to myself. The thing with Barton here, though, is it's really a perfect fit, I think, for him and for Vanderbilt, right? He's a Nashville guy. He played high school football with Clark Lee, Vanderbilt's new head coach, right? So like those guys have known each other since they were probably 10 years old. He knows Barton's connections in Nashville and the Southeast. I guarantee you they've talked about prospects probably weekly, you know, for a long time. So for Clark Lee, I don't think he sees this as any risk at all, right? I mean, this is a guy who he's been able to pick his brain on prospects forever. They've been lifelong friends. And, you know, Barton as the GM there will be overseeing, at least from what I understand, you know, the director of recruiting marketing, the director of recruiting scouting, right? So he's running the recruiting department. It's not just, hey, Barton's doing all the evaluations on all the guys. But I think it's a really good fit for Vandy. And honestly, it's a move that Vandy, I think, should make because they need to think outside the box, right? Like that's the team that has to be more different than anybody else in the SEC, in my opinion.
Well, Bud, this is something because I do follow my alma mater, and I noticed when Mel Tucker got the Michigan State job, one of the first hires he made was a really hot social media recruiting director to make sure that whether it's TikTok or Twitter or wherever it is that they've got to get these kids, that they look the best. And it sounds like part of what you're talking about here, Bud, is what he not only has, and this is where you do bring in the outside person. Because maybe collegiately, they don't get all of what's happening technologically, particularly at Vanderbilt, where that's not their MO. And it sounds to me that part of this hire is setting up that part of the department, getting the people who can effectively use the technology that we have in front of us to make sure they're doing the right things to get these kids interested in Vandy. Is that accurate?
That's definitely accurate. And I think that's another area where Barton plays well because he understands the sell of the city of Nashville. He's a lifelong Nashville guy, right? Like if you're going to win at Vanderbilt, and of course that's a relative term, if you're going to win at Vandy, you need to be able to sell sort of the big city thing, right? There are not many SEC schools in kind of big metropolitan cities. I mean, Athens is pretty close to Atlanta. Tuscaloosa is close enough to Birmingham, but they're not actually in the city, right? So I think that's
in Columbia, it's Columbia after all.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, speaking of Columbia, Justin King at South Carolina is like one of the best marketing guys in the country. I mean, they really value him for sure. I know other schools would like to poach him away. Yeah, that's a big part of it. You're exactly right.
Bud, you were one of the first at 24/7 Sports yesterday to talk about Ohio State and their COVID situation. From what you are hearing, I know that everybody yesterday somewhat defiantly was like, no, we're playing. But obviously, as we've seen, this can change quickly. What is it that you are hearing, the likelihood that Alabama and Ohio State takes place Monday in Miami?
So I don't have anything new since, yesterday afternoon. Our guys at Bucknuts are all over this. Obviously, Brandon Marcello, hearing things as well, our national reporter. Basically, I think the game gets played unless something changes. Now, we have, and that's a qualifier. We've seen things change plenty of times this season.
Sure.
But I think as of now, I think that the game will get played. Now, I think if there's any real doubt about it getting played, they need to move it as quickly as possible because this is a national championship. It's got a lot of moving parts, right? It's not something you just want to delay, kick it back a day or two like you would a regular season game potentially. But I think they're going to play this thing.
We were talking, sorry, Mark, to jump in, but, we have thought for a while, why is this game being played on a Monday night? And we think it's strictly because ESPN owns the property and Monday night is their football night. But it gets no oxygen because of the NFL playoffs always being the weekend before it. And now, but it's not just wild card weekend. It's super wild card weekend. I mean, it literally on sports talk radio and even on the 4-letter network, they're going to be talking about the NFL and all of a sudden it's going to be 5:00 and they're going to go, Chris and Kirk are doing a game at 8. Hey, let's Alabama, Ohio State. Anybody excited about this?
I agree. I understand why they have the 11-day delay because they want to make sure both teams can get healthy and all this stuff. And you don't want to, if somebody gets dinged up in the semifinal, honestly, like we saw this year with Justin Fields, we don't really want that to impact the game. But it does bleed in. I think there is a bit of an eyeball issue there. Although the numbers for the semifinals, especially at Clemson, Ohio State, were pretty good. So that was encouraging for a sport that's had very down numbers this year.
Well, there's no doubt that those were good. But what our point is here on Monday, I mean, we're going to do 3 hours. We do more college football on this show than most shows.
Yep.
And how much are you going to get in when you had now 6 wild card games? I mean, I do think going forward, this is something that the sport better look at because the NHL controls all of the oxygen in the room.
NFL is king. There's no doubt about it. And I would like to see it moved up as well. Maybe play it midweek.
Thursday. Right? I think if this game instead of Monday were Thursday, and David and I talked about it, Thursday night football is a thing. And I think, a lot of this was because of crowds. David pointed out, you want to accommodate people come in for the weekend. They just miss a day on Monday. At the end of the day, this game's not being played for the 75,000 in the stands. It's being played for the somewhere between 10 and hopefully 18 million on television. And Thursday may do it better.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's going to be an interesting game, though, regardless. I think.
Who do you and I both liked Ohio State off the hop against Clemson. You'd said all the bowl games. I'm not doing anything until live betting starts. Got to get a gauge on it, with the exception of Ohio State. I'm taking the 7.5. Did you jump quickly on the 8, or are you waiting?
No, I actually think I like Alabama here. There are some things that Ohio State did to Clemson that I'm not sure are repeatable against Alabama for a couple different reasons. First off, I think Ohio State actually had somewhat benefited from only playing 6 game schedule. They had not shown much of what they ran against Clemson in their Big Ten slate. They just didn't need to. They were almost kind of snake in the grass a little bit, if you will. The use of the tight ends as they did, they played a huge percentage of their snaps basically trips into the boundary, right? Which is not something that Ryan Day has traditionally done, but clearly he spotted something that Clemson's defense struggles to adjust to by loading all those players into the short side of the field and then messing with their coverage checks. So that's sort of Ohio State having to play their hand. And now Nick's seen that. And Saban's got 11 days. He's like, okay, what are the chances that Ohio State has another really big trick up its sleeve? I'm not sure on that. Additionally, they kind of hung Shaun Wade out to dry in that game. Ohio State did, and he got picked on quite a bit. If you saw, 24 was, I think it's his number, was getting picked on a lot. Now, here's the problem I have with this. I like to think about why teams do things. Why did Ohio State continue to leave Shaun Wade in single coverage out there, despite the fact that Cornell Powell was kind of eating his lunch? My opinion is that Ohio State is pretty damn scared of the other guys in that secondary, being one-on-one. The thing is, Cornell Powell is not Devontae Smith. If you leave Shaun Wade on Devontae Smith like that, I mean, he might score 4 or 5 touchdowns. So I have some concerns about the rest of Ohio State's secondary in that the Buckeyes thought it appropriate to go ahead and leave Shaun Wade in one-on-one, even though he was getting beat a lot, because they were so scared they had to protect the rest of their secondary. I also think, and my friend Deontay Lee on Twitter pointed this out, he's a coach in SoCal, almost all of Ohio State's pressure in the second half of that game with its defensive line was coming on them jumping the snap count. They had Trevor figured out, especially once ATN started cramping. Like the threat to run really wasn't there, and they were able to jump the count. That's another thing that I think Alabama can stress in practice this week, and they probably won't, have that happen. I'm not sure Ohio State can cover Alabama, and I'm really not confident in Ohio State's D-line getting pressure on Alabama's offensive line. So I think Bama will score a lot.
But you think Bama will slow down Ohio State? Because I got to admit, that offense that Ohio State ran against Clemson, I don't think Alabama stops that offense. I mean, Alabama's linebacking play is poor. It's poor. The Alabama's defense in the middle of the field is not good. And Ohio State put those 2 tight ends out there, and I think that type of offense can give Alabama a lot of problems. And I know they didn't run Fields much, and goodness knows when he did, he nearly got knocked out of the game. But, there have been a couple times this year. I mean, Trask and company threw it all over for 46. Ole Miss threw it and ran it for over 50. I mean, Ohio State's got just as good a personnel. And they got a quarterback that's going to go in the top 5. So they have the ingredients that have given Alabama problems in these big games. They have everything except probably the dominant wide receiver.
But I think their receiving core in totality is just as good as Alabama's. I mean, you have Garrett Wilson and Olave. I mean, I think that's pretty close to as good as Mechie and Smith, although apparently Jalen Waddle might play in this game. I'm a little skeptical of that. I think that's probably Bama throwing that out there to make Ohio State waste some of their time scheming on it. But if he does play, and if he's actually healthy enough to play, A, that'd be remarkable. And B, I mean, that offense with Jalen Waddle in there, especially given the experience Mechie has now, is just absolutely ridiculous. I think Ohio State can score on Alabama. By the way, I think they had planned to run Justin Fields a ton against Clemson. He had 50 yards rushing through the first 20 minutes of that game. I mean, I was all about the Justin Fields over prop on rushing yards, and I was like, oh, cool, we're gonna get there by halftime. And then he gets popped, and I was like, oh gosh, this is gonna be a bad beat. This is not good. So I mean, obviously, I want Justin to be healthy, but that was a bad beat if you took that prop. Yeah, I think Ohio State can score on Alabama. I do think Bama's defense is better than the Clemson defense that Ohio State faced. I don't think Clemson has the same difference makers at corner and at DN that it had in previous years, but I think they still try to play defense in that way somewhat.
All right, let's go to a couple different directions other than the championship game. First, if Luke Fickell didn't pull one of the, whether a Lynn, whatever coach you want to say, blowing the clock management at the end of the game, because they did. They blew that game, and Georgia took advantage and won. Good for them, and they played hard. They did not pull a Dan Mullen and say we're not trying after they lose, because they tried from the get. If Cincinnati would have won that, where would they have finished? Would they have finished? David asked the question, if they had won, would they have finished ahead of Notre Dame? Which means as high as they could have got is maybe, what, 6th?
I
think
think
it wouldn't have been ahead of Oklahoma or A&M.
I think they could have finished ahead of Notre Dame if they had beaten that. If they had beaten that Georgia team. I will say, by the way, I thought Kirby Smart's clock management and game management was just as bad as Cincinnati's was. I mean, punting in that situation, just because you won the game does not mean that decision did not reduce your chance of winning the game. You overcame your own bad decision, which Dabo, this is another thing. I think these college coaches have got to do a little bit better job of consulting with their analytics guys and saying, okay, going into the game, what is the expected point total that we need to win? Like, what does Vegas think? What do we think we need to get to? And in that game against Ohio State, I think the over-under was like 76, and the spread was only a touchdown. So you have to be thinking, all right, we need about 40 to win this game. And then you can kind of adjust up or down based on how the game is going. I think midway through that first quarter, you probably got to think, we might need 45 to win this ball game. And 3 punts from about midfield on 4th and 2, 4th and 3, 4th and 2 for Clemson, that you can't afford to give away possessions like that. That extra 35 yards you're going to pick up for your defense is not as valuable as the shot of you keeping possession of the ball. Like this is just, it's improper calculus that these coaches are making.
Yeah,
I think.
I thought Dabo kept thinking he had the 2017 Clemson defense instead of punting to the 2020 Clemson defense. Can I ask you a quick Gators question? I thought I saw in your recruiting rankings that the Gators went from being in the top 10 in and around early signing day to now outside the top 10. Is that others getting guys? Have the Gators lost guys? What's going on there?
Sure. So our recruiting rankings currently, right, they show everybody who is signed and then also everybody who is verbally committed to a school. So Florida had a couple kids who were verbally committed to them who I don't think that they wanted to take, either because they thought, okay, using the spot on this kid was too risky because his grades are not where we want him to be, and you only get so many signings. It's not like back in the day when Houston Nutt could sign 38 at Ole Miss and then just figure out who gets in when they go to enroll. So now you have to be more judicious with actually the letters of intent you send. So they lost 2 kids who are, in my opinion, not going to, probably would have a hard time qualifying at an SEC school. And so that dropped them in the rankings. They didn't lose anybody who had already signed with them. And I think that was kind of by plan.
Okay. Fair enough.
And Sark at Texas. How long will it take him? Is it the right hire? I mean, we've not had a lot of luck with Nick Disciples, but he's coached before. We've had a few people asking us, to me right now, it's only going to be an incomplete for the first couple of years, but Bud, what's there? How long does it take to get Texas where Texas needs to be?
So I think Texas has quite a bit of talent. They need to improve their strength conditioning program, in my opinion. They need to get some toughness into that program. They need to start dominating some of the weaker teams in the Big 12, right? That Tom Herman, one thing that did him in was they played the most stressful game every week. Every single game they played was a one-score game somehow. I think they had 38 of them in his tenure, which is just, an absurdly high number of single-score games. I think Sark, look, I'm not a college ball decision maker, but it says something to me that the guy could, fail at Washington, could fail at USC, go to Alabama for a couple of years in the Nick Saban rehab program. No pun intended. Obviously, he's overcome, the alcohol issue. This guy has got to be so well respected in the coaching profession as far as his coaching acumen to then bounce back and get the Texas job. To me, yeah, that's probably not fair to some other coaches out there, but he might just have some really, really special coaching ability. Otherwise, I can't see how he would bounce back from all this stuff and get that job. He's going to have to do a good job on the in-state recruiting. It's an interesting hire. Like, is he a guaranteed upgrade from Tom Herman? I don't think so. But clearly, Texas thought it was time to change course with Herman.
When the money people want change, they get change. We saw it at Auburn, and we just saw it at Texas. He's Bud Elliott, 24/7 Sports. Nolecast. And well, if you think you know college football, reach out to Bud. He needs a new podcast partner. Thanks, Bud.
All right, guys, take care.